Good morning, everyone. Welcome to researchEDHome. This morning is the final morning of our current program, and we're both excited and a bit sad. But what a session we have in store for you. I've been really looking forward to this one. We have two fantastic presenters with us this morning. We have Helena Moore and we have Kathryn Morgan. So if you do not follow those two amazing people on Twitter, I strongly recommend that you do. Helena works as part of the learning design team at Ambition Institute, I believe, and Kathryn, you've held several positions of leadership in schools and across MAPS, particularly regarding professional learning. So we've got two really expert speakers this morning to talk to us about professional learning, professional development. And this morning I'm particularly excited because it's all about harnessing the work of Viviane Robinson, and so we're going to get quite a few pearls of wisdom, I believe. Over to you, ladies.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Helene, for the introduction. As she said, I work in the learning design team at Ambition Institute, and before that worked as a school leader in primary schools in London.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been a primary school teacher and a trust director of professional learning and development, but I've recently been working with Helena at Ambition Institute in the learning design team on leadership programs. And it's here that we both realised that we shared a love of the distinguished Professor Viviane Robinson's school leadership research.
And it's that we're going to tap into for the next hour or so with you guys on this very sunny Friday. So thank you very much for joining. We're going to take you through some thoughtful content. And so there'll be points at which we pause for you to read slides. We haven't disappeared. If there's some silence, just take that moment to have a look at it. And also, as there are two of us, we don't quite trust the Wi-Fi, or Kathryn's Wi-Fi in particular. So we're going to turn our videos off, but we will be back on at the end when we're going to give a bit of a stab at some live modelling.
We've got quite a lot to share with you in terms of slides, so it might be worth minimising the icons on the right-hand side, just so that you can get the full scale of what we're going to share with you.
So let's get started. We know that schools are highly complex organisations, and both as a result of this and a result of many external drivers, those who work in them, teachers and leaders, have to be used to dealing with what often feels like constant change. Change fatigue is quite simply a real thing. In the last 10 years alone, there's been loads of change in education, whether that be around curriculum, testing, teacher standards and funding models. But it's really important to note that student outcomes have not necessarily improved at the rate they were expected or indeed needed to. And we, Kathryn and myself, are really interested in understanding why so many of these very well-intentioned change initiatives don't always bear the fruit of improvement. And it's this that we want to hone in on today.
So in this session, we'll share some of the key insights from Viviane Robinson's most recent leadership book, Reduce Change to Increase Improvement. It provides a roadmap for leaders and schools to make the types of changes that stick and avoid the change merry-go-round that Helena spoke of. So before we dive into the book, let's take a moment to pause and consider the various change initiatives that have taken place in your school in the last couple of academic years. When I think back over the last 15 years or so and reflect on the change initiatives that I was either on the receiving end of or led on, my list is really long. This in part is because of our typical approach to school improvement. For example, we tend to perceive a problem to be solved, and this is often driven by data analysis and statistical measures and external factors. We then develop a solution, often looking externally and using other schools as a marker of success. We introduce the solution to all staff in the form of a staff meeting or inset, and then begin to implement. It might be that we write up supportive documentation and then monitor its implementation in the classroom. Finally, we evaluate it, often scrambling around for data and sometimes reverse engineering the impact to prove to others it has made a difference. I know I've experienced this as a deputy head and also as a chair of governors. In some schools, an external consultant might have been paid to design and deliver and document a new solution, skipping most of the previous steps. Our focus on change is being further perpetuated by the well-intentioned lead on an aspect of change in either their team, across the whole school, across your school and also impacting another, and then finally across a series of schools. This qualification has been as much, if not more, about career progression as it's been about developing our knowledge and expertise of leading improvement. The problem with this spray-on school change approach is that it's unlikely to lead to substantial improvement in student outcomes and often leaves busy teachers disillusioned and aligning change with performance management rather than performance development.
Professor Viviane Robinson is very clear to differentiate this change from the improvement that we actually want to see in our schools. And it's crucial that school leaders pause to reflect on this difference. As Viviane Robinson highlights in this quotation, change is a value neutral term. It can be both good or bad. School improvement, on the other hand, is necessarily good for students and teachers alike. We can't think that by achieving change, we've improved anything. They're two very different things. And change for the sake of change is not desirable, as Kathryn's already highlighted. What is desirable is that change that leads to improved student outcomes. It follows then that it's the quality, not the quantity of change that really matters.
So when we shift our language from change to improvement, leaders become more accountable for delivering high quality developments in their school. Change is a high cost resource in both time, money and energy. Therefore, we need to spend more time interrogating the logic of proposed changes and really consider how this logic might be received by busy teachers.
So the key words in that quotation is thinking around developing and communicating. And as part of this communication, it's important to ask these questions, allowing debate about whether proposed change is likely to deliver the improvement that we want. What exactly is it that needs improvement? Have we got to the root cause of the problem? Or do we have a solution that we're instead trying to retrofit? Why does it need improvement? Why is the status quo unsatisfactory? And how is it that you know it's unsatisfactory? How have you aggregated and triangulated your information to be as certain as possible that this is an important improvement for the benefit of your pupils? What are the causes and what are the likely school-based causes of the unsatisfactory situation? And which of those are things that you can actually affect? And finally, how well does the proposed solution address those likely causes? What does success in the solution look like? Will that success really address the problem and address the causes that you've carefully and intentionally dug into? Instead of taking for granted that change or innovation will lead to improvement, we as leaders should do the opposite. That is, believe that change will not deliver improvement unless there are structures and processes like the above in place for ensuring that all involved can learn how to turn the change into the intended improvement that we need for our schools and for our pupils.
So we started off by making the distinction between change and improvement. We're now going to explore 3 key aspects from Viviane Robinson's book that will support us to lead improvement that is embedded and sustained. Reduce change to increase improvement provides a detailed and practical structure for helping school and system leaders to increase improvement while reducing ineffective change and innovation. Helena and I have chosen 3 key aspects to share with you today, but it is worth saying that we are only able to provide a high-level overview, and therefore we really do encourage you to purchase a copy for your school, and like any book or piece of research, really interrogate its ideas and suggestions through the lens of your own school context and starting points. In the book, Viviane Robinson identified the mindsets, processes, and behaviours that contribute to successful improvement. Her thinking is influenced by the work of Chris Argyris and Donald Shern. They argue that people have mental maps with regards to how to act in situations, hence the rationale behind our presentation title, Theories of Action, Mental Models in Motion. To begin with, we're going to revisit some of Viviane's earlier research on student-centered leadership. In the book, Viviane draws upon some of her earlier research that demonstrates the quality of leadership can make a substantial difference to the achievement of students. Shifting the focus away from leadership success being measured through an orderly environment, perhaps the popularity of the SLT, and the buy-in of innovations, Viviane Robinson makes the case that leadership practice should be deemed effective if it has a positive impact on student outcomes. However, it is difficult to isolate the contribution of leadership to student outcomes. Of the hundreds and thousands of studies on educational leadership, only a handful have empirically examined the impact of leadership on student outcomes. Based on these studies, Viviane Robinson calculated the effect size for different leadership practices and organised them into 5 leadership dimensions that have the most impact on student outcomes. It's important that we start on this work as it guides the content of her book. For example, when we consider goals, Robinson believes that goals should affect student outcomes, and one way to achieve this is through an inclusive school climate. When considering resources, this isn't about gaining more resources, but really considering how leaders are utilising their existing resources in a strategic manner. In terms of teaching and learning, this requires us to go deep with instruction to maximise student learning. This is about leaders getting as close as possible to the live practice in the classroom. This is less about mandating more classroom visits or teacher observations, and more about establishing a shared theory of effective teaching in which there is a collective rather than individual teacher responsibility, the shared endeavour, relational trust, where it matters that both parties are trying hard to make developments in the classroom to improve on student outcomes. Everyone in school, including teachers, are instructional leaders. In terms of professional development, we need to be asking ourselves the question, is it perpetuating conformity or really encouraging teachers to foster their own development, taking into consideration individual starting points, subject knowledge, pedagogy that fits certain subject domains? Are people feeling motivated and inspired to access professional development that they know is going to ultimately positively impact on student outcomes in the classroom? And finally, and the 5th dimension, it's worth here sharing a quote from Viviane Robinson, which captures the importance of this. If students and staff do not feel physically and psychologically safe, if discipline codes are perceived as unfair and inconsistently enforced, then little progress is likely in the improvement of teaching and learning. So these 5 dimensions work together and have strong reciprocal effects. Although the 5 dimensions tell leaders what to focus on to make a bigger difference to student outcomes, they say little about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions needed to make those dimensions work in a particular school context. Research is suggestive of the importance of 3 interrelated capabilities known as the how.
And these 3 capabilities are that leadership improvement is a challenging task, but requiring the relevant knowledge from both research and experience in order to solve the complex educational problems that stand in the way of achieving our improvement goals, all the while building these relationships of trust with those involved. And it is the combination here of what you might call heart and smart that's so important, and where we go back to a number of pieces of current work in the sector. The importance of domain-specific knowledge organised around the persistent problems of school leaders, from my colleagues Jen Barker and Tom Rees, alongside the importance of relationships and trust that Steve Mumby highlighted in his recent paper, and which also neatly takes us back to the beginning of researchEDHome, where Carly Waterman spoke so clearly about the synergy between both, the importance of knowledge and leadership alongside relationships and trust, with the latter being what Brick and Schneider refer to as the connective tissue that holds improving schools together.
So we've begun by revisiting some of Viviane Robinson's earlier work on student-centered leadership, ultimately keeping this as the focus of any improvements that we carry out in the school. We're now going to have a look at a new aspect of Viviane's work and really explore how leaders can go about influencing improvement in the classroom. Within the book, Robinson focuses on the importance of theories of action, drawing upon the work of Argyris and Schön. We all have mental models that influence how we act in certain situations. Let's first begin by what we mean by mental models. Mental models are effectively our maps of the world. They consist of our connected knowledge, including experiences, and they shape how we see things, guiding our actions.
So if mental models inform our actions and practices, and the reason behind teachers' existing practices are really important, as what sits behind these practices are each teacher's underlying set of values and beliefs. And when leaders might overlook this, they run the risk of trying to get teachers to do something that goes against the way that they as teachers see the world and their place in it. And so before barreling on with trying to change practice, effective leaders need to properly understand the practices that they are trying to change, as Viviane Robinson highlights in this quotation. Because too often we think about the future without truly understanding the present. But ignoring the present is part of why habit change is so hard, as Robinson has highlighted here. It's important to remember that the practices that leaders are trying to change are usually serving a purpose for teachers. Our usual way of doing things hasn't just been plucked out of midair, but instead comes about by adapting and adopting practices over time that we each believe will help us achieve our goals and the pupil outcomes for pupils that we wish.
So we've started off by looking at mental models. Let's now explore what we mean by theories of action. A theory of action is a link between cause and effect. So for example, if we take a particular action, then we expect that behaviour to have specific effects. A theory of action connects the actions of teachers with the consequences of their behaviours, the learning and achievement of their students. Digging deeply into the underlying beliefs and values is critical here to leading change well. Doing so helps leaders understand what underpins teachers' existing practices and what they might need to do in order to change this practice. The key point here is that we can't talk about beliefs until we have actions. We need evidence to inquire into to really consider what the barriers might be for individual teachers and how we as leaders can support them to make sustainable improvements in their classroom and develop new habits.
Robinson's work is influenced by Argyris and Schön, as Kathryn's already mentioned, and Chris Argyris is one of the founding fathers of organisational psychology. His main focus is on learning, and most of all, the pitfalls that inhibit learning. And they identify two different types of theory of action. And I think we can all relate to this distinction between your espoused theory, what you say you do, and your theory in use, what you actually do, and acknowledge that they don't always match. An example of the former, the espoused theory, might be a teaching and learning policy. In reality, however, based on beliefs, tweaks and adaptations to practice over time, the reality is that your theory in use or your tacit theory of action might look slightly different to that teaching and learning policy. And we've all experienced this difference between the two in change initiatives that we've either been part of or led during our careers so far. Please take a moment to reflect on an example. We often think about this when we think about the difference between practice in schools at the beginning of a year and maybe towards Christmas or Easter, because we tend to start change initiatives in September. We make a good stab of it in autumn term, however tired we might be getting. And at this point, the espoused theory is really influencing our mental models and practices. By Easter, however, this looks somewhat different. Our tacit theory of action, our theory in use, has been adapted and shaped over time. And that is now what's really guiding our actions and determining the reality in our classrooms.
Related to this is Argyris's viewpoint that when we sense make about something, we see the world as we are, not as it is. So for example, when thinking about how we sense make, it's important to refer back to his earlier work and introduce you to the ladder of inference. This is how people process information and assign meaning. In other words, how we sense make. What the concept implies is that we begin with real data and experience. We then choose a set of selected data and experiences that we pay attention to, and this begins to shape meaning. To this selected data and experience, we attach new meaning and develop assumptions. These assumptions could be about other colleagues. These assumptions could be about what we think other people think about us, think about our teaching, think about our leadership. And we come to conclusions, and we finally develop beliefs. These beliefs can impede the developments that we make within our practice. For example, they don't think I'm a very good teacher. She's coming in to observe me because she doesn't think I can do this. I'm one of the worst teachers in the school. I'm not a leader people respect. Beliefs form the basis of our actions, which create additional real data and experiences. This is why it is so important that as leaders, we embark on a very interpersonal process with colleagues to understand why they make the choices they do. How have they made sense of the new initiatives we're sharing with them? What hard reality and facts have they started to select and consider in different ways? Interpreting this reality through their own lens, through their own way that they see the world based on their mental models. Hence making assumptions, perhaps about a strategy or an initiative that we need to adopt, the rationale and reasons behind it, and also how likely they think it is to actually impact student outcomes. They begin to then draw these conclusions and create a set of beliefs that in turn impact their actions. This is in part why we end up with a gap when we introduce a new initiative in school and we carry out staff meetings, inset days and professional development programs to support people with the implementation, that there is often a gap between what people say they're going to do and the reality of how they then put this into practice in the classroom. So if you want to lead change and propose a new theory of action to the one that you know is already in place, how do we go about marrying up the objectives between individual theories of action and the new theory of change that's aligned to a particular initiative that you feel is going to make improvements to student outcomes? This is where we're going to now explore the engagement process. So we've focused on the importance of student leadership, making sure that leaders see their job and responsibility as influencing positive improvements in teachers' classrooms, making sure that they're getting as close to teaching and learning as they possibly can, and fostering the types of relationship and trust that will enable them to do so. An integral part of that process then is understanding theories of action. What are the beliefs and values that are underpinning this teacher's practice before I go in and try and support them to make improvements and developments? How am I going to support them to bridge the gap between what their current practice is like and the practice we would like to develop in the classroom? The engagement process is a really useful tool to ensure that we don't bypass our colleagues, which is a usual approach, and in fact we engage them from the outset. Let's take a moment now to explore what we mean by the engagement process. Effective leaders spend time understanding how the proposed theory of action compares with the existing theories of action of those who will carry out the change. These leaders engage in dialogue with the people they seek to influence. This dialogue digs deeply into both leaders' proposed theory of action, for example, the change, and the person's existing theory of action, which is underpinning their current practice. The best way to do this is to begin by genuinely inquiring into the theory of action that the other person holds. Robinson refers to this as the engagement approach.
Let's look at the benefits of this. So if we think about this in context, the leader here is taking the time to listen to teachers' objections to the suggested new practice and to actually engage in and explore the teacher's own current practices. This in turn creates a safe environment in which teachers feel that they can talk about their beliefs and values that underpin their current practices, as well as uncertainty about this new practice that's being proposed, including, for example, the opportunity to quite simply say, I'm not sure I know how to do this. I'm not sure I know how to make this change. A vulnerability that is vital, but not always present in schools.
The opposite of the engagement approach is what Viviane calls the bypass approach, which might be familiar to some of you. The school leader sets out to simply persuade their staff of the change, thus totally bypassing the teacher's own theory of action and therefore less likely to change behaviour and lead to improvements. If we think back to the scenario of the second slide of this presentation, where we were faced with a blank page and asked to consider all of the change initiatives that have taken place over the last couple of academic years, what tends to happen is we use data analysis to find an area of improvement, select a solution, sometimes engaging with other schools who might have been graded outstanding or who have been shown to be particularly good in a certain aspect of teaching and learning or pedagogy and practice. And we take this on board and we make it mandatory and we share it with staff and we all start to do it. But in this process, we haven't inquired deeply into what practice looks like in the classroom, their business as usual.
And this can mean that the improvement simply doesn't work. It just doesn't fit. In not engaging, this may result in asking someone to adopt a new way of doing things that actually conflicts with their fundamental values and beliefs, which can also create in turn fertile ground for a cynical, negative, resistant or subversive reaction to the change initiative. And what can then tend to happen is that with the lack of successful implementation for that original solution, we go on to blame the solution itself, thinking that we implemented the wrong thing. What that other school was doing just wasn't the right thing for us. We don't reflect on the way that we've tried to implement it. We don't reflect on the way in which we've bypassed our staff. Instead, we go off to find another solution, perhaps for another school. But again, by implementing it using the bypass approach, this leads down that well-trodden path of lots of change, but not much improvement.
So it's important to note here that the engagement process is reciprocal in that leaders' alternative theory must also be explicit and open to revision, especially if there's tension between the two. Here we're going to take a moment to pause and look at the 4 stages of the engagement process. Using the engagement approach effectively relies on leaders undertaking genuine engagement with teachers. This can't be superficial consultation where leaders engage with staff to advocate their already set agendas. Instead, they remain open to suggestions and possible solutions. For many leaders, this involves a substantial shift in focus from advocacy of their change agenda to collaborative inquiry and evaluation of the relative merits of the current and proposed theory of actions. Consider how many times before embarking on a change initiative, we actually inquire and ask staff, what do you think? Do you think this will have an impact in your classroom? And interrogate what it is that we are suggesting and putting forward. When leaders and teachers engage in this process properly, they co-develop a shared and agreed theory of action, leading to change that sticks.
And one way to do this is to use open to learning conversations to do that co-construction. There are many types of conversations that we can have as school leaders. Coaching conversations, difficult conversations, and of course those day-to-day interactions around the school, which can often be the most illuminating. But this model of conversation, an open to learning conversation, is that which Viviane Robinson uses to ensure engagement in the improvement process, and that in turn builds and maintains that all-important trust. And these conversations are based on these three guiding values. The first, increasing the validity of information, whereby you disclose the reasoning behind your views, going back to those actions that you've seen. The second, increasing respect, by listening deeply, by communicating properly, even when you hold different views. And the final, increasing commitment, fostering that ownership and going back to that co-construction and shared process. And there are some key components to help you in having such conversations.
These are the key components of an open to learning conversation. The first part is about describing your concern as your point of view. It's important here that you have evidence to be able to draw upon and rich examples from practice that you've seen in the classroom, so that any points of view you're sharing with a colleague are then backed up by examples that you've seen. It's really important to stress, though, it's your point of view. Thinking back to what we said about Chris Argyris's work and how we tend to view the world through our own lenses. In the second stage, describe what your concern is based on. So, for example, this could be that you feel that an element of a colleague's practice isn't necessarily having the desired impact on student outcomes, but they might be blissfully unaware of this because they're unable to see this once in the throes of teaching. It's also worth considering how biases that we hold can also prevent us from being able to identify areas of our practice that need improvement. So in the third stage, it's important that you invite your colleague to share their point of view about what you've shared with them. This is where active listening is so important. This is a conversation where we are listening to understand. We're using dialogic inquiry to really try and learn why somebody is carrying out their practice in the way that they are. What are their beliefs and values that underpin those actions? What difference do they think they're making? This is not about interruption. This is not about judgment. This is not about waiting your turn to take the part of the conversation. Once you've listened to their point of view, you want to paraphrase this to check that you have heard them correctly. Once they agree that your paraphrase is accurate, you can then start to draw out some of the important assumptions that you're now making, thinking carefully about that ladder of inference and how we start to shape and mould reality. Finally, together, you make a plan to get what you both want, which is ultimately improving practice to improve student outcomes in the classroom. Making sure that both parties see this as a shared collaborative endeavour. This is where Viviane Robinson's work on relational trust is so important. The more that we have these conversations, the more that colleagues see that we take it as part of our role to be really supporting the development of their practice in the classroom, the more likely they are to be vulnerable, to show elements of their practice that perhaps they know that deep down need improvement, or to share misconceptions that they hold but have been otherwise anxious of sharing for fear of judgment. The caveat here is that this takes practice. You can't just have a one-off open to learning conversation and think that suddenly you'll have the type of relationship and trust in place to be able to really understand people's theories of action. This needs to be an embedded aspect of the way that you carry out improvement initiatives in your setting. Helena and I are now going to take this opportunity to live model to you what this might look like in reality. And the caveat here is that we're obviously engineering this to try and provide examples of each of these stages. It's important that you see that we are trying to identify the aspects of this process and what they actually look like in reality of having a conversation with another colleague. It wouldn't be appropriate for us to go through stage 6 and make a plan, bearing in mind that we have such a short amount of time. But nevertheless, we're going to have a way of exploring the first 5 aspects. So, firstly, Helena, I just really wanted to thank you for allowing me to come into your lesson this morning. It was really insightful to see the students and yourself working so hard. There were just 1 or 2 things that I felt we needed to have a discussion about, though. The first is that I was surprised to see such little use of the cold calling strategy that I know that we implemented in September. And I made it very clear when sharing with you the rationale for the new strategies that we were expecting this to be an integral part of everybody's lessons so that we could work to improve the thinking and participation of our students. So I'm just a little bit concerned that your lack of use could be perhaps because we haven't given enough time and energy into developing your professional learning that sits alongside this, or perhaps there's another reason that's preventing you from using this tool. I'd be really interested to hear your viewpoint.
Yeah, I suppose when I think about it, I probably used it a bit more back in September when we first introduced it, and it's kind of just sort of trickled off. But I think a key part of the reason it trickled off was because a couple of the pupils kind of complained that they found it really intimidating and they felt like I was kind of picking on them. And actually that went as far as some parents complaining as well. So for that reason, I made the decision that it wasn't the right approach for me to use with my pupils in my classroom.
Okay, so just to double check then, so one of the reasons that you're not using it is because students have not taken to it and there's been some pushback from them, and you've also had some parent complaints, is that right? Yes,
that is right. And I think also, like, to be honest, if we're having this conversation, you know, it's I find it quite a patronising technique. Even when we use it in our own PD, I really don't like it, and therefore I really empathise with those children and those parents.
Okay, so can you give a little bit of insight into what it is about the strategy that you don't like?
I think it is that idea of almost trying to kind of catch people out, whether they've been listening, whether they've got something to say. And for some people, and I think myself in this, it just takes me a bit of time to process things, and that's why, you know, some pupils take that time during the lesson to kind of do that processing, and then when the independent work comes, that's where they're ready to kind of to shine in that way. And that pressure to do it earlier is something that really, yeah, for some pupils in my class is just not working for them.
Okay, so can I just double check then some assumptions that I'm making here? So part of the reason for you not using this strategy is not only because you've had some pushback from your students where they don't particularly like cold calling, it makes them nervous, and some parents have complained, but it's also about your own personal use of cold calling and how it makes you feel. For example, when I use it in professional development after school or in insets, is that right?
Yeah, I hope you don't mind me saying, but yeah.
Not at all. So I think this would be a really good opportunity for us to really unpick how we launched this initiative and whether or not we did a good enough job of explaining the rationale behind it, that it isn't about catching people out, that it is about raising the amount of thinking that students are doing, really ensuring that we're hearing a range of views and not just picking on the same students each time. And the same goes for staff. But I think on hearing your viewpoints and just checking my assumptions, it's really necessary for us to take the time to sit down and consider which other members of staff might be feeling this way and therefore aren't putting this strategy into practice, and whether or not we've made a good enough job of actually explaining the thinking behind this and how we move forward.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so it's worth noting here that obviously was our attempt at sort of staging the types of conversations that might take place. But it's a really good example as well of the bypass approach, which is an integral issue in this whole process. Where as a senior leader, I've decided we have a problem with student participation and we want to develop their thinking based on what we know about developing long-lasting memories, etc., etc. We know that Teach Like a Champion is absolutely for really fantastic strategies. So we selected one particular strategy, shared it with staff, might have had a bit of training, boom, off we go. And now we're looking to see that in practice. But obviously for this particular teacher, they haven't felt comfortable from the word go. So they've sort of had a go and sort of said, in terms of their espoused theory, this is what I'm doing. But in reality, they've reverted back to their theory and use because that's based on their beliefs and values about how they feel about being cold called and being what they perceive to be picked on. It makes them anxious, makes them nervous. So unbeknown to them, they could then be projecting that in the classroom.
Yeah, and just to clear the air, that's not my opinion on cold call. But yeah, so as Kathryn said, you can therefore use these open to learning conversations to kind of address where bypass has happened, but also, as Viviane Robinson claims, to set up that engagement in the first place, to go through that engagement process. And therefore, as you're getting ready to lead implementation, they're really powerful in that sense too. And when we're talking about leading implementation, we're going to turn finally to the EF implementation guidance. The EF implementation guidance is a great tool for scaffolding and considering deeply the implementation of new initiatives. It's the crucial work of leaders that Kathryn and I have been discussing today, in which they're thoroughly engaging with their teachers and their teachers' practice before implementing something new that sits in that first quadrant of explore. And it's the key to successful and scalable improvement that is then sustained. It's a vital stage of exploration, discussion, engagement, and interrogation, thinking back to those early questions we looked at, before we even get to that planning and preparation stage, let alone jumping straight into delivery.
It's really important here, as we draw some conclusions, to think back to where we started, which was really distinguishing between change and improvement, and really thinking about what types of changes are going to lead to sustainable and scalable improvements in our schools. We then focused upon student-centered leadership, making sure as leaders we align our role, our job, our responsibility, our influence in the classroom, developing the practice of our colleagues. That requires really rich relationships, knowing your staff, building up the type of trust where people are willing to share anxieties, misconceptions, and their true beliefs and values that underpin this. The caveat is this won't happen with one conversation. This is about dialogic inquiry over a sustained period of time, embedded within the leadership. It's an integral part of a professional development culture and tightly aligns to the implementation guide, especially looking at the foundation and explore stage. If we spent more time really inquiring in these stages of implementation so that we deeply understand people's practice before we then try and introduce a new initiative to make improvements, then we'll end up in improvements that have a long-lasting impact on student outcomes. All that remains to be said is finishing on one final quote that both Helena and I feel is particularly pertinent to what we've covered in this session. That we can't love the future until we live in the present.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, there was so much in there. Sorry, I was just finishing my notes here with this beautiful quote. It's quite interesting that you went back to the implementation guide at the end, because that explore stage, there's actually so much to it before. And I think for me, the word that perhaps you didn't say, but that really aligns with what you've discussed in this session, is the word readiness, and making sure that that readiness is there. And if it's not there, do not go ahead, do not even attempt to scale up. You know, you need to have that readiness in place, both in terms of, you know, staff readiness and structures and systems and things like that. So those two things marry really well, and I hadn't actually made the link, you know, in my own thinking. So thank you, that was illuminating. What also was really interesting is that you went back to Argyris's ladder. That took me back to the very first time I presented in public, because we use something similar with the ladder of participation, which is obviously a kind of a spin-off or something parallel. And in that ladder of participation, you've got those different stages of engaging, you know, people in your organization, such as, you know, the kind of tokenistic approach, which I think, you know, you've been very clear in your presentation is not the thing to go for, but I feel that very often that's actually what happens in schools. And I'm just wondering why that is. You know, why is it that leaders at times, I don't want to do generalizations here, but why is it that, you know, perhaps instinctively there's a feeling that conversation is good and opening up to staff and getting their ideas is important, and yet there's not much that comes out of those conversations, and we still feel that there's a kind of, what did you call it, the bypassing or placating, if you if you want to be a bit harsher. So how come this happens?
So that's a really interesting question. So for some time now, I've been fascinated with organisational development, which is integral to this process, really, and the way that we view change. So for us to have meaningful dialogic inquiry, that's going to take a considerable amount of time. Schools are often time poor, and sometimes we make assumptions and we have a tendency, and again, I don't want to make generalizations because not everybody does this and all contexts are different, but we almost have a tendency to consult staff, get their opinions.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Your sound just broke up.
Sorry, we get their opinions, but the information we get back is so dependent upon the questions that we're asking them. And also, it's really important that we recognise, for many staff, they're going to give us our espoused theories. They're going to give us back what they think leaders want to hear. So we're almost always dealing with this espoused theory of what's actually happening. And I think the example that Helena and I tried to show there with our open to learning conversation was, too often we provide people with information and we expect them to go off and to do it, to put it into practice. But there is a real tension there to how that's been received by that individual. Have they really understood the rationale and the why? And this takes such a long time. And I sometimes trying to see improvements far too quickly, basically. I don't know, Helena, what do you think?
No, I agree. And I think it comes back to, like, if we, as you say, Helen, go back to the implementation guidance, where we think about sort of really, you've got that halfway to get round the circle before you even start implementing something in terms of delivery. And that starts to demonstrate that idea of the time needed to kind of fully explore, to understand that fit, that feasibility, that readiness, as you say, which we don't often afford ourselves in schools. As we kind of alluded to, it might be that there's that temptation that we have to launch things in September and there's not that time to think about it over summer and things like that, and to also have those conversations. So it leads sometimes to that kind of jumping forth. And there's obviously external drives as well that can push that at times.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. There's a good reason why we've got this kind of espoused theory phenomenon happening, because the stakes are quite high in some settings more than others, and I suppose perhaps sometimes it's wise to toe the line. But the other thing is, for me, the important distinction is not just to engage staff and to listen to them, but it's for staff to have the feeling that they have been listened to and understood. And I think you've made that so clear. It is very important. And I wonder to what extent that consideration is considered. You know, it's this feeling of being listened to and understood. And I really, really like the fact that you've made that so clear. I was also thinking, so it's more my thinking than questions, but there's so much that came to me as I listened to you. Let's say you have a team, a leadership team, who are genuinely try to foster more dialogue. I think one of the issues is that if you don't have the feeling as a staff body, that you have been understood, or that the subsequent process of that if the process was not really reciprocal, that you've talked about how you need to be open to suggestions and open to change the change that you are suggesting. If that falls short, then the second time they try to instigate this kind of dialogical process, there is that lack of trust, because, you know, why should we bother if it's not really going to be listened to or taken into consideration? So even with the best intentions of trying to establish dialogue, it's actually very, very difficult to get it right.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to turn my camera off, because as we know, my Wi-Fi isn't very strong. So hopefully you can hear me clearly now. I think what tends to happen is that, as we've said, this takes time and it takes a considerable amount of practice. And from the word go, we need to explain to colleagues why we're entering into this dialogic process, why it is that we want to inquire into their beliefs and values that are underpinning their practice. And we almost need to model that ourselves as leaders. And I think, without wanting to be very American and fluffy here, vulnerability and leadership is really, really important. And I think you're right. If, for example, they share really open and honest insights, and yet they don't feel that they've been listened to the change initiative, then there is a requirement there for leaders to really clearly articulate why it wasn't appropriate need for flexibility of plans. She also talks about the need that there might be the case where you have an individual teacher's theory of action emulating in that leader's mindset, and it might be here that you need to seek external expertise, because the two of you aren't actually able to create that new change initiative where you have buy-in from both parties, and you're also then able to identify a solution that is going to solve the problem that you're faced with. So she does stress the importance of really engaging with external experts to support this process if it's required, and obviously depending upon what it is that you're looking at.
Thank you. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I'm so glad that you used the word vulnerability, because I'm wondering, so if you have a team who tend to go for the persuasive process, I think you called it, it might be because, showing us, I don't know if I want to use the word vulnerability when it comes to that, because I think that might be one of the problems. So what about leaders who might feel that they might be seen as weak if they are open to, a genuine process of reciprocity and flexibility? Do you think that's perhaps an attitude that's encouraged by some of the courses that you mentioned at the start of this presentation?
Helena, I'm conscious I don't want to take over.
No, it's fine. I was just a really, really good question. I think that the intentions we have, so we hope not, and that the idea that we we need to develop that knowledge, but we are always developing knowledge, and there will be that kind of going out there to kind of get that knowledge, which will give us that competence to kind of maybe come up with the solutions, as Kathryn said, but that also we're not going to have all the answers. And I think that is just really important for all leaders to acknowledge, and then therefore as a role of leadership development programs to do that also, which comes back to kind of those 3 capabilities that we looked at of Viviane Robinson's earlier on in the presentation, about how, yes, by using that educational knowledge fosters that relational trust as you're sort of tackling those problems, but that using that knowledge doesn't mean having all that knowledge in your head at that moment that you kind of need it to demonstrate. And I think that goes back to Kathryn's point about Viviane Robinson being kept like really conscious of articulating. You might not have the expertise between the 2 of you, particularly if you think about senior leaders in terms of curriculum, where they're not specialists in that particular subject. And we can't forget the sort of importance of subject distinctness when we're kind of tackling senior curriculum leadership. It's okay to go out there and get that knowledge elsewhere, but it's just the fact that we are using that knowledge to help tackle that problem. And actually, as Kathryn said, by modelling the fact that we might go out there to get that knowledge elsewhere and that you don't necessarily have it, is really important in that fostering of trust, which then in turn develops that sort of positive professional climate that is a key aspect of school leadership.
Thank you. Sorry, Kathryn.
I was just going to say one last thing. I think it's really worth saying here that this is where Jen and Tom's work around school leadership being a domain in itself, and leaders really understanding teaching and learning curriculum so that they are able to draw upon a really rich bank of bodies of knowledge to help them solve these types of problems. But yes, in the case where they perhaps don't have that expertise and knowledge, then that's why, as we know about effective professional development, it's important that we also engage with external expertise.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. Do you want to, if you open the Q&A box, we've got a couple of comments / questions. I think it's from Carly Waterman. Fantastic presentation. Is the increased commitment stage of the open to learning conversation the natural outcome of stage 1 and 2? I have to process that a bit. If we fail at stage 3, is it the fault of not doing stage 1 and 2 well, or could it be that some people will never share your rationale? The model assumes that in the end, everyone is persuadable, and if they are philosophically opposed to you, it might not be possible. And she says, I guess it's important to recognize that that might be the case.
Wow, trust Carly to come up with a superb question like that. Thank you, Carly Waterman. So yeah, I think it's really, Carly and I have had many conversations about the importance of developing the types of relationships and ultimately trust, where you can have conversations with colleagues that are really going to get under the nitty gritty of people's practice. And you absolutely can't do that if people don't feel that they are supported and that this is a very non-judgmental approach. But absolutely, if you have difficulty at stage 1 and 2 and you come in too strong and it sounds like you're being judgmental, then you absolutely are not going to get the type of rich, soft data that you need to understand why people are carrying out the actions that they are. And so I think this is where this work actually aligns really nicely to fierce conversations, radical candor, that actually feedback, that the giving and receiving of feedback is really integral to establishing the type of culture where all colleagues in any sector are going to improve. And Carly's right, you might come across colleagues who, with all the best will in the world and, you know, trying really, really hard, you might not be able to get them wholeheartedly on the same page as you. And perhaps it's the, I don't know, the philosopher in me though, that feels that it's still worth trying. And you might just be surprised that the more that you do model and model these conversations and engage in these conversations and also share with colleagues your sort of inner narrative, the more you build up the type of communication where people will be willing to expose their true thoughts and feelings. I guess the tension there is, as a leader, you don't want to be perceived as not having the expertise to be able to lead. And I think it is that fine balance between showing that human side of you, that heart, alongside the smart.
Okay, thank you. It's that last phrase. I had actually written it down earlier. It made me giggle. Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I can completely understand that, you know, depending on the context, depending on the setting, the opener, you know, your first salvo in that conversation could quite easily put people in a position of stress and anxiety straight away. I just want to finish with Carl, because Carly has sent a second question. So let's finish with this. How important is practicing role-playing the open learning conversation? Would you recommend that? And would you recommend scripting them?
Helena, do you want to jump in?
Having just done one, Carly, I'd say yes, if you're going to do that in a real situation, 100%. Obviously, scripting them is, you can probably script like the open, but you can't then script the latter parts, because that's going to be responsive to the response of the teacher with whom you're working. But I think being really intentional, and obviously as Kathryn highlighted, we were like super intentional about kind of ticking off almost those steps, those components. But being really intentional to make sure that maybe you're sort of not slipping back into kind of perhaps a way that you might normally have that conversation, just to even reflect on how that feels. I think it is important to kind of have that practice. But as Kathryn mentioned, like definitely, if you haven't listened to it, the Ollie Lovell podcast kind of has Viviane doing a way better job at maybe like an off the cuff version than we did. But no, it's good to have a listen to her and see what she has to say as well.
I think the key thing to note here is that it's about trial and error with this approach and finding the fit that suits you and your team. So if you see it as a step, and you know, as soon as you put your foot on step one, you're essentially going to explain that there's an element of practice that you'd like to explore and understand more. So actually that's a phrase that I would put in there. I'd like to understand more about something that I saw, or something that you did, knowing then in the second step that you're going to explain why you perhaps have decided to discuss this today. So I linked it back to mandatory guidance that had been given in September, and then you know that you need to invite the other person. So it is about saying, however, I really want to hear your views, and I'm aware that I might have made the wrong assumptions, or I don't always think we share that element with people, and then they need to really feel that we haven't made our mind up, and this isn't about right or wrong. With dialogic inquiry, it's about developing understanding, so that you can really, really inquire into why choices and decisions have been made, knowing that I'm not trying to persuade anyone, and they're not trying to persuade me. This is about learning and developing a shared understanding.
What a lovely way to finish. I think we're going to leave it here. Right. Well, it's been quite a journey. I'm so pleased that we've ended up with, you know, this particular session to end the program. Helena, Kathryn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day. I just wanted to ask if you would be willing to share your slides, perhaps. I did not have time to make all the notes that I wanted to make. So it's a very selfish request. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a lovely day. Thank you very much. Take care. And right, everyone, that takes us to the end of our current program and current offer for researchEDHome. From next week, we will be putting up some previous sessions from Red Loom Durrington particularly, and we'll see where that takes us. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for engaging with all those sessions. It's been quite a journey for myself as well, and I've learned an awful lot, and I hope it's been of help to you too. So I just wanted to finish by thanking the whole team, Matt Hood and Emma Lark and Jack Ramsey, who have been behind the scenes organising, supporting with the tech and with everything else. Take care, and we'll see you at some point. Thank you. Bye-bye.